Welcome to another exciting episode of Humanity 8.0, a podcast where we talk about movements and initiatives that seek to move humanity to its next epochal iteration. This podcast is brought to you by Witlingo. When it comes to managing a community, one of the keys to success is the ability to effectively communicate with the members of that community. If you are a service coordinator or responsible for community engagement, Witlingo provides a multi-channel, multilingual notification and engagement platform to help you work more efficiently and effectively. For more information, please visit www.witlingo.com. That's www.witlingo.com. And now, here's your host, Dr. Ahmed Bouzid.
Professor David Coady, welcome to Humanity 8.0.
Thanks for having me.
Wonderful. So as I was just telling you, you're the first one that I have talked to who is 14 hours ahead of my time zone. And like you put it, 14 ahead in the future, 14 hours in the future. So that's so right now it's 7 p.m. in East Coast US. Over there it is 9 a.m. ish.
Yes.
9 a.m.
Saturday morning.
And on a Saturday. So thank you once again for sacrificing your morning and give me 1 hour of your time. So the reason why I reached out to you and I read several of your articles and I ordered your book. I think it was published in 2019 by what's the publisher? Sorry.
I'm not sure which book you're referring to there.
Routledge, right? Routledge, yeah. Conspiracy Theories, is that right?
Oh, the edited collection, yes.
Yeah, the edited collection, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So that one that looked very interesting. Yeah. I did interview Professor Basham. Is that the way you say Basham?
Lee Basham.
Lee Basham, yeah. I interviewed him. Very interesting conversation. It was a long conversation. We were enjoying ourselves. We forgot the time. So it ended up being like a 2-hour conversation. He's a very interesting guy and very interesting thoughts as well. Anyway, so here's sort of the thing that propelled me to just look for someone who has thought philosophically about conspiracy theories. Is I believe that we're living in a time, and again, it may be that it is just me, not remembering the past as well as I should. It seems to me that we are living in a time where dissent is not allowed as much as it used to. For example, in the mainstream media, at least in the US, right? I've noticed that if you deviate a little bit from the narrative about, I don't know, Ukraine or Palestine or whatever that may be, you're flirting with danger. And lots of
absolutely.
And it just feels to me that right now, anything that deviates from there is cast as or stigmatized as a conspiracy theory. So number one, do you agree that we are living in such times? And if so, why do you think we are, given the paradox of so many sources of information, right? People are able to access all kinds of, are able to post, or maybe that's a result. But let me give you the floor. Why do you think we are living in such times?
Well, I think, I think there's a causal relationship between these. So, I mean, it's a change in degree. It's not a change in kind. There's always been attempts to narrow public domain within, public debate within carefully chosen limits. But of course, now we have so much information from so many different sources, the efforts to impose those strictures on what's legitimate and what's illegitimate coming from the most powerful institutions around us have intensified. And one of many instruments I think they have in their arsenal is the term conspiracy theory. It's a term, and I think there's a bunch of them, and they're popping up more and more, which operate, I've used this analogy in a number of sources, that something like the way the word heresy operated in medieval Europe, that the powerful institutions at that time, in particular the church and the state, used that term to make sure that opinion was kept within very tightly constrained ways. And the term conspiracy theory operates effectively, I think, very much that way. If you go against opinions that are endorsed by powerful institutions, the church isn't so powerful now, but the state certainly is, and corporations are extremely powerful. Yes, you're likely to be castigated as a conspiracy theorist. I think there's a number of other pieces of terminology that have been around, an interesting history of their own. I think extremist or extremism operates in a very similar kind of way. You'll see there's a growing body of literature just in the last couple of decades, not even 2 decades, really a decade and a half, I think, about the so-called problem of extremism, mostly coming from social sciences, but I think unfortunately coming from certain philosophers as well, arguing that yes, there's this growing problem of extremism, and that extreme views are bad and need to be brought back to the center somehow. Yeah.
So let me share with you what I think the lay person, when they hear that this is a conspiracy theory or such a person is a conspiracy theorist, believes, right? So I'm a lay person, right? So for me, when somebody says, and I think I've evolved a little bit and sort of become more conscious, but in general, I think when somebody says that this is a conspiracy theory, it means that it is far-fetched. It means that it is unlikely to be true. It means that the person who is pushing it is a little bit off. Either they have an agenda, or they're psychologically imbalanced, or some combination thereof. And so that's sort of my sort of general understanding of what we think it is, and that's why it's in a way, if you accept the definition as such, obviously when you hear somebody who is reliable say that such a person is a conspiracy theorist, or this is a conspiracy, you sort of at the very least start at in a negative footing towards it, right? You are skeptical of it, you avoid thinking through it and all that. Now, here's the thing that sort of I've been thinking about, which is we all know that there were things that if somebody had said this is happening, and people did say this is happening, it was extremely far-fetched. For example, the one that always comes to mind is Iran-Contra, right? The exchange of weapons. I mean, it's to this day, it sounds like anybody who, if it was not proven, anybody who'd be saying it today is like, are you kidding me? Come on, Israel selling arms, and then the United States, it just doesn't make sense. It's just far-fetched. So my question to you is this: do you think that those who are scheming behind the scenes, let's just put it in that way, are aware of this bias towards sort of Occam's razor, right? That's the simplest explanation is the one, right? Do you think that that is part of, meaning when they want to do something, they make it fantastical, so that when somebody tries to describe it, they sound fantastical and then bad almost by. But what do you think about that?
Well, I think what counts as a simple explanation, we're very much socially inured to identifying certain kinds of explanation as more simple. But I don't think conspiracy is necessarily complicated. The alternatives are often, in fact, far more complicated. So, I mean, to start with, there is something glaringly perverse about the fact that the term conspiracy theory has the kind of negative connotations you talk about, because, people do conspire. It's a very common form of behavior, and it always has been. And in every culture, people have conspired historically, and even more so when it comes to politics. Politics is the locus of conspiracy, and every form of politics is rife with conspiracy. So, there can't be anything wrong with believing that people conspire, because obviously they do. on the, I mean, the example you give is a very good example of the dangers of the pejorative connotations of this term, because it, stops people from believing something, which in that case is true. And there's lots of cases we could cite of things which were derided at the time as conspiracy theories, and which made the move to, as it were, incontrovertible fact. And unfortunately, far too often, it was far too late to do anything about them. That the perpetrators were dead, or and so on. So look, one glaring example, I know in the 1990s in the United States, it was widely derided. There was a view that was going around. It was being reported by several journalists that the CIA was plotting with and funneling money into people, drug dealers, who are bringing crack cocaine into the hearts of American cities. And indeed, and it turns out that that's true. And, it's well documented. And unfortunately, times have moved on and nothing's going to happen to the people who brought this about. But you end up getting, the conspiracy baiters, as I call them, the people who promote this idea that there's something wrong with conspiracy theories. You will find that they tend to say that, well, there are certain classes of people who are more prone to this form of irrationality than others. And they usually say, well, Black people, people in the Middle East, and it's highly racialized, and a very much a respectable form in many cases of expressing a form of racism.
So in your collection that you published in 2019, the first chapter is about
So I just want to make a correction. It was reissued in 2019. It's actually
2006, right?
2006, I believe. Yeah.
There was a reissue in 2000. So the first one, I think the first chapter, was about Popper, right? It was an essay by Popper or about Popper?
Yeah. It was.
Can you tell me what
Popper.
Can you share with us, because he's all about the open society and so forth. And openness means people have the right to explain and explain things in whatever way, and so one should be open to receiving information from others as opposed to narrowing. So what was his stand on that?
Yeah, well, there's an irony there, absolutely. So he's all about promoting openness, but I think he's the person who really popularized the term conspiracy theory. The term wasn't widely used before Popper. It really came into its own in the early 60s, especially after the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And then kind of grew from there. But yes, I mean, Popper makes a whole array of accusations against conspiracy theories, many of which are not consistent with each other. It's quite a task trying to get a consistent story.
But what is his drive? Is it because he is coming from fighting anti-enlightenment stands, or what's his take? I mean, what is driving his take?
Okay, well, I think he's a creature of the establishment in many ways. I mean, Sir Karl Popper says it all. It's
there you go.
And yes, so he is in the end defending the powerful. And so look, he says at one point, for instance, that yes, there are conspiracies, but they don't happen very often. But then he goes back on that because it's just obviously untrue. Everyone conspires some of the time. Some people conspire almost all the time. He also says elsewhere, oh yes, they happen often enough, but they're not very important. They don't have a significant role in history. But he himself mentions things like the conspiracy to assassinate the Archduke Ferdinand, which started the First World War, which is a kind of important event.
It is not unimportant.
And yeah, and yes, points out that Hitler's rise to power was the result of conspiracies, et cetera, et cetera. I mean,
Yeah.
they're clearly important. He also says, and this is also not true, that they're rarely successful. There's some precedent for this, because that's what Machiavelli claimed, and he's citing him on this. But again, that's just not true unless you have unreasonably high standards for success.
Yeah. I mean, if one, let's just look at the 60s, right? And let's look at the big events there. Okay, there's the assassination. There is the Bay of Pigs, right? There is the Gulf of Tonkin. You have the assassination of JFK. There is Johnson's withdrawal of an order by Kennedy, and it's all well documented. Right, to bring the forces back, right, to the 1,500 Marines who were there, which happened, and the order was given, I don't know, 2 weeks after the death of Kennedy in November 1963. There is the assassination of, Malcolm X, assassination of Martin Luther King, RFK, and others, all happening in a span of a few years. And it happened to folks who were really challenging the establishment big time. Okay. I mean, MLK became a big threat, I believe. This is my opinion, right? When he veered into the poverty, sort of class warfare, so to speak, right? Before that, civil rights, okay, fine, good. But then when he started injecting, or actually he was doing that from the beginning, but I think he intensified. Same thing with RFK when he became a viable candidate. So now, and then the way they were assassinated, right? I mean, one man for JFK, and I think there was a second commission in the 70s that said there was a second gunman, and it was passed by, right?
Well,
So
I
you
mean,
see all
I
these.
don't know.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I don't know where, I don't have a very firm opinion on the John F. Kennedy
Me neither.
assassination, whether there were others involved or not. But I mean, I do think that the label conspiracy theory works to undermine investigation and inquiry, which are important and shouldn't be undermined, because after all, lots of assassinations are provably the products of conspiracy. Whatever, John F. Kennedy may or may not have been a conspiracy behind that, but Abraham Lincoln, there was certainly a conspiracy. There was a Confederate conspiracy by at least a dozen people involved in his assassination. And, because it's far enough away, nobody bothers to try and undermine that narrative.
Yeah, well, my point is that those events that I cited in the 60s, one after the other, happening in such a rapid and just suspicious way, why doesn't the fact that they happened, right, work towards saying that, you know what, it couldn't have been these explanations, one explanation of the other one, right? Cannot stand in the way, right, of being able to say that conspiracy theories or conspiracies are real. They are real. It could, meaning if one were to just cling to a hermetically sealed explanation for each. Okay, it was this guy, it was this happening, it happened, right? How can they still do that, even though you can see in the 60s that these events are monumental, right? How can that not challenge my point? How can that not challenge the notion that conspiracy theories are just far-fetched, and you should just dismiss all of those as being conspiracy theories? Sort of just the critical mass. My point is that the critical mass here that should tip in one way or the other, but it doesn't, and it hasn't. Yeah. And that's very interesting to me as to why such a resilience.
I mean, very, very often the opposite theory is what's sometimes called the coincidence theory. So, people who posit conspiracies, as I think we should do more of, are often accused of failing to recognize the fact that sometimes, as Brian Keeley puts it, shit just happens. And yes, it's true. Shit does sometimes happen, but sometimes,
No.
sometimes if there's enough of a coincidence, then that should prompt you to start investigating and start looking into it. So I've suggested, popularizing the term coincidence theorist as a pejorative to balance
I like that. I like that.
the pejorative term conspiracy theory. Someone who just coincidence theorist is someone who just refuses to suspect anything below the surface of even
It's
just
it's
glaring
intellectually
coincidences.
lazy in a way, right? And
Yeah,
curious. Because
absolutely. And
somebody could come up with a. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
So I think the other thing that's going on there is, of course, people have always and always probably will, want to believe authorities.
Yeah.
There's a very deep, there's a long history of political philosophies saying, the state is just like your father or just like your parent figure. And you have to have this attitude of default trust towards the state and other figures of authority. And I think that's, an essential part of the conservative mindset. And, it does go very deep. It's not just one particular culture or one particular time period. People don't want to challenge received opinion because they don't know where that will end up.
True. And they have more important things to do, right? Which is take care
And indeed, and they've got their own lives to get along.
their own lives, and so I mean, and then also I think opening up that Pandora's box, right, will just get them into a state of, I don't know, perplexity that is not comfortable, right? Okay, if the government is lying to me, where else could they? So I might create anxiety, and people, I think we try to avoid anxiety instinctively, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, there are folks who make a living investigating, writing books, right, and so forth, and that's fine. And I think, and here's the interesting paradox. I don't know if it's a paradox, which is the following: in the U.S., right, people write these books that explain, that are called conspiracy theories about Watergate, about JFK, obviously, about RFK, and they write these books and they give talks. Nobody comes in their way, right? Which tells me just how effective that label is, right?
Yeah.
All you have to do, even though they have given you evidence, even though they are a scholar, even though they have a track record, even though it makes sense if you listen to them, it coheres, right? Even though all those things, I think somebody will just not listen to them don't give them a chance because of that label. It's just amazing that so the next concept is the
just to
sorry, go
say
ahead.
something.
Absolutely.
In addition to that, it's true no one will typically stop them from going and doing that, but I don't think we want to understate the amount of just plain censorship that goes on. I mean, I think that the recent banning of TikTok in America is an egregious and obvious example of censorship, and a lot of the rhetoric justifying that censorship was about extremism and conspiracy theory being promoted on this platform, when the truth is it was really the only social media platform widely available that wasn't owned by an American corporation.
And if you are somebody who are curious about something, you go and find out and you make up your mind, and this notion that folks, you have to protect people from certain pieces of information because they might hurt themselves. I don't know. Maybe. But I'm going to take, so the concept of manufacturing consent, right, by Chomsky, right? Meaning there is an effort by the establishment, and it's a proactive effort. It's a continuous effort to, so consent doesn't happen by itself. There's an effort for that, right? And people, I think, I think the vast majority of people do not sort of know that concept or are familiar with it. It's like air, right? You live in the narrative that is surrounding you, right? But I think that concept is starting to emerge into the, I would say, mainstream consciousness because of these actions like banning TikTok. Banning TikTok is something that everybody like, why? They ask the basic question, why? Why are doing that? And then they start getting into conversations about, what could it be? Why is the government freaking out? Russia or what? And there's of course there's a whole narrative which is interesting, right? Of a conspiracy by the Russians who rigged the election, which is ironic, right? So you have this elaborate conspiracy that to this day has not been proven one way or the other. I don't know. I don't believe in it, to be honest with you. I think the system is too robust for that. But it's there, and it's informing these kinds of actions that are radical. So my question to you is this: the system itself, it seems to me, is starting to expose itself through these acts of desperation, it seems to me, right? Meaning they're showing the face that there is manipulation, that there's lying, that there is to the mainstream. It has always been there, but what has been lacking is the fact that the mainstream consciousness has been, like you said, right? It's it's the authorities and law and order and so on. But once they start touching things like a social media platform that I don't know how many hundreds of millions of people use, or at least in the US, and when they start touching that, they're starting to touch the common person, let's call them common person, common man, who's not interested in, he or she are not interested in getting into these philosophical debates. But then viscerally, they start to ask questions about why. Right.
Yeah.
So do you think that there is going to be a backlash, or is a backlash evolving, from that level to the level of, you have folks who are on CNN, if they say something wrong, they get cast out, or MSNBC, and then they go off, they create their own show. Are they hurting themselves by sort of shrinking their audience, the media, for example, and so forth?
In the long term, they definitely are. There's a very striking phenomenon, probably not since then, the 60s, is the dramatic sorry, what was I've lost the word for this. The generation gap was the big term in the 60s, and there is now a generation gap.
Huge.
In terms of public attitudes on an awful lot of issues. And TikTok was something that was principally aimed at people who were between sort of 18 and 30, say, and on a whole host of issues, almost everything, the most obvious one being Palestine, the difference in attitude towards that issue
It's massive.
between the young and the old, and is very dramatic. So look, frankly, I have, in the long term, quite a lot of hope about what's happening, but I think in the short term, I don't see much hope at all. In the short term, the next 4 or 5 years at least, I think things are looking extremely grim. And on that concept of manufacturing consent, it's interesting that the establishment narrative tends to be that people are polarized, increasingly polarized, and this is supposed to be a problem. They're polarized between Trump and Biden, say, and
abortion,
and these kinds of issues. But the concept of manufacturing consent that Chomsky and Herman had certainly took into account that there will be disputes within the ruling class, and there'll be lively debate and confrontation about those issues. But the most important issues remain bipartisan. And the elections just don't touch them. And I think it's kind of ironic with all the stuff about Trump and the so-called deep state. I shouldn't say so-called deep state because it's a real thing. But him presenting himself as an enemy of the deep state is frankly just a joke. He's, if not a member of it, certainly an instrument of it. But he does, appeal to people who, perhaps aren't very educated and, are aware that something is wrong, are aware that they have very little influence over policy, economic policy or foreign policy. But yes, the fact that he signals these real issues doesn't mean that, of course, that he's a real solution to them.
You've been listening to Humanity 8.0 with your host, Dr. Ahmed Bouzid, founder and CEO of Witlingo.